Hey there, it's Silver. This is Testament, the Order of High Human. So this is an action RPG, a first-person action RPG that's actually being made by a very small team of only about 15 people, I believe, is what the press release said. So that's a really small team for something like this. And, I mean, first-person games in general often require a lot of extra work because of all the animation work and stuff that has to happen, and the fact that you can really, like, rub your face against all the textures and things, so they have to look really nice. And, you know, there's just a lot of consideration to a game like this. So the first obvious thing to talk about is how the game looks, and it's actually a pretty impressive game visually for such a small team, but it's not just about fidelity. It's not the fact that all the textures are super high resolution and it has all the fanciest modern effects and things. It's more about the art direction. The game has a pretty distinct art direction to its areas and to its enemies and things that makes it look pretty unique, and it reminds me a little bit of something like Gothic, the Gothic games, because those were like a sort of very European-centric kind of off-kilter fantasy that was a bit odd and really interesting, and this game has a similar presentation to something like that in terms of how everything looks and the fact that it's just kind of an odd version of fantasy that's kind of interesting to go through. And I think one of the main things that the developers did as a small team to accomplish a pretty high detail, high fidelity world like this is use a lot of sort of loading screens in strategic places. So this is not an open world game, but it does have a lot of backtracking, and in fact it has some Metroidvania elements and things as well, so you can go back to places you've been to before and, you know, fight enemies you otherwise couldn't, or go down paths that were locked before but you got something that allows you to go down them now, things of that nature. So there is definitely an openness to the world, but I think the thing they did was pretty smart, and that is to create these sort of chunks of the world that are separated by loading screens, so it feels pretty open, but it gives a more manageable amount of stuff for a small team to do, because a full-on open world of this scale I think would take a much larger team to actually accomplish. So I think the way that they did it is pretty smart, and it lets them keep up a good amount of environmental detail and fidelity. Some of the areas you'll come across are really impressive looking and have a lot of detail, especially some of the larger areas that involve like where relics are held. You'll see lots of huge statues and like big chasms with waterfalls and all sorts of impressive vistas like that. And I would actually say vista is a really good word to describe the game, because some of its most impressive points are that. They're big vistas where you can see a long distance and you see all this art design kind of coming together in one place, and it looks really nice. So I'm definitely impressed with how a lot of the areas are presented. I like just roaming into a new area that I haven't seen before and getting to explore it, because there's usually a fair amount of detail in what you can explore, and the areas are open enough to allow you to have multiple paths through, and usually multiple ways to tackle the issues of that particular zone. But the game's main mechanics are combat and platforming and exploration, puzzle solving, that kind of section. So it's sort of split in half between like platforming sections and combat. So first off, the combat. You've got 3 different sort of weapons that you can switch between at any time, just on the 1, 2, and 3 keys. You have a sword of some kind, a bow of some kind. Both of these get upgraded as you go through the game. And you have spells on 3, and you can equip 2 spells, 1 in each hand, and eventually you get the ability to equip 4 spells that you can swap between easily with the scroll wheel, so like 2 sets of 2 spells. And you can also use the scroll wheel on your bow to switch between different arrow types once you start getting those. I think the game was inspired by things like Dark Messiah a little bit, because the combat feels a little bit like that. It's not quite as good as Dark Messiah combat-wise, but to be fair, Dark Messiah is a really, really high bar to pass. So this game still has pretty solid first-person combat. You have a sword, and it starts off pretty simple because you just have a 3-hit combo and a power attack on the sword, but there's also a pretty significantly sized skill tree that's actually like a big circle that goes into each of the 3 things you can equip, and there are all sorts of things you can find in the skill tree. That's actually one thing I have to give the game really good points for, is that the skill tree is actually interesting. It's not like 5% crit chance or anything like that. They're all like new combos, new attacks, new spells. They're big improvements, so you feel like you're really improving in power when you put a point in the skill tree. None of it feels like filler. So you'll eventually be able to improve your sword skills to include things like a chargeable power attack for a lot more damage, multiple different combo attacks that you can use, switching between light and heavy to do different things, like a big palm thrust that can actually knock enemies down or send them back if they're like a more robust enemy that doesn't get knocked down easily. And also there are certain attacks that can interrupt enemies, like for instance the second hit in your main combo, which you can quickly expand into a 4-hit combo pretty easily. The second hit can actually interrupt enemies. The same thing goes for like charged power attacks and stuff, so you can use these hits strategically, try and place them on enemies that are about to like wind up an attack or something to interrupt them. You also have a dash that has a relatively long cooldown, but it does cover a fair amount of distance. You can't use it in the air, unfortunately, but it's, you know, it's just a ground dash, but it's still covers a lot of ground, so that means you can use this to sort of duck in and out of combat quickly and time your strikes and stuff. So the melee combat is pretty good. Although I would like it if the dash was a little bit more responsive in combat, by which I mean, like, once you are doing something, swinging weapon, casting a spell, whatever it may be, you can't use your dash for like a sort of invisible amount of time after doing that. So sometimes you like hammer the dash button to get out of the way, but you can't dash yet because you like just finished an attack and you're sort of winding down a certain amount of time. It's a little bit strange. It does mean that the dash isn't as responsive as I'd like, but it still works pretty well, I would say. Then you've got the bow, and the bow is actually a lot of fun to use. You can draw an arrow for, I think, like an infinite amount of time, so you don't have to worry about that, but it does fly in an arc. You will get some upgrades to this pretty early on in the bow side of the skill tree, where you can get it to fly a little bit farther, a little bit straighter, but it still feels very accurate and fun to use. And you get a sort of, like your classic video game focus style ability that highlights stuff in the environment, and one of the things that this does is it shows you the weak points on every enemy. It'll sort of glow a bright white, so you know where to hit them. And this is useful for the bow, because if you hit those weak points with an arrow, then it'll do like drastically improved damage, so you really want to hit them as much as possible, because there are a lot of enemies that will take, like 5 or 6 arrows to go down, whereas like one weak point shot will do it. And you can't hold that many arrows at first, like about 10 or so. You can, of course, expand this later as you go down the tree and stuff, but even then you still don't have that many, so you do have to be a bit careful about how you use them. And this means there is, of course, a stealth system in the game. You can crouch and do like a sneak attack on an enemy for improved damage with your sword, but you can also do this with a bow, and in fact you can get a skill early on that does like 2.5 times damage if you use the bow for a sneak attack, so that's definitely the intended purpose of the weapon, right? It's quiet and it's pretty long range, so you can sneak around with it, and it is pretty satisfying to go through an area full of enemies and just sort of pick them off one by one by hitting really good weak point shots, so I think that's what makes the bow pretty fun to use. And later on you do get some actually pretty interesting other arrows for it, including these ones that reflect all over the place that are really neat, and there's even a bit in the skill tree that gives you extended number of reflections on it, so you can like just have it tear through a whole chamber of stuff, which is a pretty neat idea. And then you've got spells. You'll get these pretty early on in the game, and the spells are sort of split down the middle between spells you get on the skill tree and spells you get in the story. So there are some that you can't actually purchase. You'll notice them on the skill tree as like little islands separate from everything else, and that shows you that's when you get in story progression rather than actually purchasing for a skill point. And either way, you can equip one in each hand, and the ones you start with are a basic sort of life drain that's pretty slow but actually pretty effective at healing you, and a sort of rapid-fire green projectile storm that flies perfectly straight, so you've got to aim it just right, and it does use quite a bit of your mana. You have a pretty small meter at first, and you only get 2 full-length casts of this spell out of 1 meter, but it is pretty powerful, so it is useful. And something I've noticed is as you put points into the skill tree, you're not only getting whatever the skill tree node was, you're also getting a sort of improvement to the power of that thing. So if you purchase a bunch of sword skills, your basic sword attacks do more damage, as well as getting all the various skills that you purchased, and the same works for magic and the bow as well. The sword, by the way, can also get a sort of deflect move as well. You don't have a block in this game, but you can get the sort of parry that allows you to deflect an enemy's attack, and they take amplified sword damage for a second after that. So there's a good amount of options in combat. I think the game is clearly going for more of a combat-focused experience, like they've deliberately designed a lot of mechanics to allow you to approach the combat in different ways, and the enemy design is actually pretty cool. There's a good amount of enemy variety that's very much dependent on the area you're in, but they all have some pretty odd looks to them. Some of them are, pretty normal, like halflings and stuff like that, but some of them are really weird, like these weird headless, horned, dark knight things. There's quite a bit of variety and a lot of creativity in how the enemies look. But outside of the combat, I do think the game kind of falls apart a little bit. Not to the point that it totally ruins the experience, but its other aspects are not as strong. Like, for instance, the story is kind of told in an odd way. The voice acting is not amazing, but I don't really mind that so much because, like I said, 15-person team, I'm not expecting that. That's fine. But the story has a habit of giving you contextless names and, like, expecting that you know what they are, if you get what I mean. Like, sometimes the main character will just start talking about a bunch of people using names of people that you've never met before, and it's like the game expects you to automatically know what it's talking about, and you don't have any context for who these people are because you haven't met them yet. Another time I finished a conversation with a character that I had just met at first, and then your main character muses about a dragon at some point, like the dragon must have saved him, and there's not been a mention of a dragon up until that point at all. You can't just say the dragon out of nowhere because, like, I didn't even know this world had dragons until that point. So, yeah, the story has a bit of a bad habit of giving you, like, these contextless events and names and not explaining them at all. It means that the story has a lot less of an impact than it could because half the time you're sort of lost in all these new things that the game is throwing at you that you don't have any explanation for. So it means that, like, the big lore dumps and stuff that happen aren't as interesting as they could be because it involves a lot of stuff that you just haven't seen or experienced or know about yet. And it means that the overall storytelling is kind of a bit of a jumbled mess at times, and it sort of feels like you're learning a lot about the world, but your main character already knows a lot of this, but doesn't tell you any of it. So it's like what the main character knows and what you know are two completely separate things that are kind of at odds with each other at times. But I also mentioned some platforming, and this is where things get a bit unfortunate. You will come across these very beautifully made vaults of an ancient civilization. These are very cool to look at and very impressive, and they're where you go to get, like, big important new story events and story artifacts and things to continue on your journey. These, however, are full of puzzles and platforming, and I think the puzzles are actually quite good most of the time, but the platforming is not as good. The puzzle solving is actually pretty fun. You've got a lot of different, switch puzzles and barrier puzzles. You've got light reflection puzzles to aim these lasers around the place. There's a good variety of them, and they are enjoyable to actually solve, and plus, it's kind of nice that you get experience for solving them. I like it when RPGs do that. But the platforming, well, I've never been a fan of first-person platforming at the best of times, but the controls in this game don't really feel like they're meant for platforming. Your jump is very odd because your running forward jump barely sends you forward at all, but your sprinting forward jump sends you way forward. So it feels like half the time you're fighting with the controls going from platform to platform, trying to not under or overshoot because you don't have a good middle ground. You can also do things like grab onto ropes, run along walls, and some other stuff like that, so you're relatively mobile, but for some reason during the platforming sections, you can't dash. The game takes away your dash and all your weapons, so you can only run and jump and mantle and stuff. That's all you get. And these sections go on for way too long. Like, the puzzle platforming sections are a neat diversion from the combat. I understand why they're there, but they really don't need to go on for that long. Some of them take a very long time with just puzzle after puzzle, room after room of platforming just over and over and over again for a really long time. And this eventually culminated in a bit that kind of made me just quit for now because I just don't have the patience for it, which is you're put in a gigantic maze and you have to go to, like, the four corners of the maze to activate these switches to open a door to continue, but the maze is filled with these walls of yellow light that instantly kill you if you get anywhere near them. And if you die, you gotta restart the whole chamber. So it's just a bunch of busy work that I really don't have the patience for, and the maze makes you do all sorts of platforming stuff that it just doesn't feel like the controls want you to do, like wall run and then jump to a different wall while you're wall running on that one. Just go back and forth between walls without touching the ground, and the walls are covered in instant death yellow barriers if you go anywhere aside from this one little section where you're allowed to run, and the controls are just not that precise and they're not that responsive in order to encourage you to actually do a sort of chain wall run like this. It becomes just a very difficult, very frustrating chamber because of the things that the game is expecting you to do while also surrounding you in constant instant death walls and making you restart if you make the tiniest mistake. So I think honestly that the overall vibe of these sort of puzzle platforming sections is they're neat and I love the way that they look visually, but they are extremely frustrating and they go on for way too long. So overall, my opinion of the game is actually relatively positive. It's got some really worthwhile combat and a lot of really cool places to explore with some awesome art direction and stuff. It's just, it stumbles when it comes to its overly long platforming sections with controls that just don't feel like they're meant for that. And the very messy story that's told in kind of a confusing way with lots of proper nouns that you have no context for. So if you're okay with the flaws, with the fact that this is a 15-person game and it's not going to have an absolutely monumental level of polish, it is actually worth getting into because the combat and character development and stuff in terms of the RPG elements for your character and all that, it's good enough to actually carry the game, and I think the little glimpses of stuff like Dark Messiah is what actually kept me going. And I think as long as you're okay with its flaws and you're very aware of its flaws, and you still don't mind, spending most of your time doing some pretty fun combat in some really neat areas with the occasional break of some frustrating sections and some oddly delivered story, it is still something to keep an eye on because I think it's impressive that such a small team managed to do something like this. So I'll link you in the description below this video to the Steam store page to the game. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.